So good evening, everyone, again, and thank you for taking time to engage us this evening. My name is Jonathan Hill, and I have the opportunity to serve as your moderator for this evening's conversation. And as we begin this evening, we want to take a moment to acknowledge the original inhabitants of this land. The name Baton Rouge comes from a red pole marked by the boundary between the Houma and Bayou Gula tribal hunting grounds. And so we take a moment to honor the resilient voices of Native Americans, Native peoples who have lived on this land since time immemorial. Let's take a moment to acknowledge them. Thank you. And so as we move throughout our conversation today, we'll ask you to type any questions you may have into the chat, and I'll pose them during our question and answer time toward the end of our conversation on this evening. If you would like to direct a particular question to one of our panelists on this evening, please also note that in the chat, and we will seek to address that later during the question and answer portion. As you noted when you came in, this session is being recorded, and we will be, I believe, sharing that post our time together on this evening. And so let me set the agenda for tonight's conversation. We'll start with some context given by Yule, who's on with us tonight, and then we'll move on to our moderated discussion. And our topics will include community perspectives, resilience and energy, efficiency solutions, and then we'll move on to industry, economic, and workforce considerations. We'll ask that you keep yourself muted throughout our conversation tonight to make sure that we can hear. We're not disturbed by any background noise. And then after that, we'll move on to some audience questions later on. And so the project team for this climate pollution reduction plan includes the Sustainable Solutions Group, or SSG, who you'll hear from in a moment, who has developed climate action plans for states and cities across the country. It also consists of Franklin Associates, a management consulting firm specializing in community engagement and outreach, who successfully facilitated more than 4,500 public meetings throughout the state. So at this moment, I'm going to turn it over to Yule from SSG, who will provide the context for our time together on this evening.
Thanks very much. So I'm Yule, and we're the project lead on the development of this comprehensive climate action plan for the Baton Rouge MSA. This is a very unique moment in the landscape of climate planning and planning writ large for Baton Rouge. If you go to the next slide, the US is making an unprecedented investment in climate action, which touches on every sector of the economy. And if you go to the next slide, this is the breakdown of almost $1 trillion worth of investment that's occurring. And of that, a chunk is funding the development of climate action plans for states and metro areas across the US under the banner of the Climate Pollution Reduction Grant, which is funding this project. If you go to the next slide, that funding program includes two major deliverables: Priority Climate Action Plan, which has already been completed and is available. We will share the link for it, as well as a comprehensive climate action plan. And that involves building a model of all the activity in Baton Rouge and the energy and emissions that result from all of those activities. We will then look at different emissions reductions pathways or scenarios and all their impacts on energy, emissions, costs, equity, and how those actions can be implemented. And that all together will be called a comprehensive climate action plan. If you go to the next slide, please. This is a profile of emissions or greenhouse gas emissions from the Baton Rouge MSA. You can see the major source of emissions is industry, but there are other large sources from residential, commercial, transportation, solid waste, and those are large relative to other jurisdictions. They're, of course, small relative to the large source from industry. So that gives you a good idea of where the emissions are coming from. And a key part of this project is to map out what the financial opportunities from the Inflation Reduction Act are and how to take advantage of those in Baton Rouge. And that's really what the Comprehensive Climate Action Plan is, and that's hopefully what the conversations today will help inform. So that's the broader context for this conversation.
Thank you.
I had a couple other slides there.
Oh, go ahead. I'm sorry.
Well, you can skip over those. Yeah. Over to you.
All right. I don't want you to not get all your slides in. All right. And so tonight's conversation aims to facilitate a dialogue that addresses common questions and concerns related to pollution reduction measures that may lead to significant changes in the community. We anticipate our conversation lasting about 70 minutes on tonight. And so for those who may have come in just recently, I want to say if you have questions, please drop those in the chat and we will seek to address them when a Q&A portion comes later in tonight's discussion. So let me introduce our awesome and dynamic panel we have. Thank each of you for being here and sharing your time and expertise with us on this evening. Let me begin with Mr. Jackson Voss, who's an experienced policyist with the Alliance for Affordable Energy, an organization with the mission to protect consumers' right to an equitable, affordable, and environmentally responsible energy system. Thank you for being here, Mr. Voss. Secondly, we have Dr. Angel Rosenberg, who serves as the chair for the Delta chapter of the Sierra Club. She holds a doctorate in cardiovascular physiology and is a passionate conservation and social justice activist involved with several organizations in the Southeast. We also have Dr. Gregory Upton, who's executive director and an associate research professor at the Louisiana State University Center for Energy Studies. An experienced economist, Dr. Upton's areas of interest is the intersection of energy and environmental economics. We also have joining us Dr. Gerard Melanson, the president and founder of Durango Works Corporation. He is an experienced workforce consultant who specializes in developing programs for the energy, manufacturing, petrochemical, construction, and transportation sectors. We also have Ms. Candace Derbies with the Louisiana House Research and Education Center, or the LSU Ag Center, who specializes in residential weatherization and energy efficiency research and development. And then lastly, Mr. Stephen Long, who is a senior architect with the city of Baton Rouge and specializes in sustainable architecture. He previously served on the board of directors for the U.S. Green Building Council of Louisiana. Once again, welcome. Thank you for being here. I'll take a moment to say to all of our panelists, if I did not do you great justice in your introduction, I'll give you about 15 seconds if you need to add something to your list of accomplishments. All right, not seeing any, let's dive into our time together on tonight. I want to begin with all of our panelists, and so this question is for each of you. We want to make sure this is conversational tonight. As we talk about reducing pollution, how can we ensure that community priorities are at the center of climate pollution reduction planning and implementation? So I'll leave that to see who decides to dive in first on that. How can we ensure that the priorities of the community are really at the center of planning and implementation? Nobody ever wants to be the first one. All right. So I am going to ask Dr. Rosenberg to come and share. She comes from the Sierra Club.
Yeah, so I'm with the Delta chapter. I'm a volunteer organizer with the Delta chapter, and you can just call me Angel. I'm like a medical scientist, medical researcher, but in this space, it's just catching up. As far as really centering community, so what we hear from people is that the climate crisis is here and now, and I think that our language should really reflect that. And so recognizing that insurance is already unaffordable, housing is already unaffordable, especially in Louisiana. I think, unfortunately, we got the worst of it super fast, and hopefully the rest of the country can learn from our hopefully leadership in this. But I think that in order to center community, we need to be really realistic and also somewhat radical, actually, frankly, radical in our language in order for people to relate and understand that we fully understand the challenges of this moment. So I think that's the way to bring people up. We've heard a lot of like very careful language from officials and leaders for decades now, and we're not being very honest about the fact that the United States is not meeting our climate goals. And even though we are having those historic investments in climate, we're also doing a lot to expand oil and gas. And that's impacting our communities, our Black, brown, poor, rural communities here in Louisiana first. So, yeah.
Well, thank you for that. Jackson, I want to bring you into this conversation, right? As you're doing your work as a policy analyst, your thoughts around centering community priorities.
Absolutely. Thank you for having me, and it's good to see everybody. Just to kind of build on what Angel said, I think that the IRA, I think that there's a lot of more complicated things to it than I think people realize. And it is really a bill that addresses the energy system much more broadly than just what people might think in the first place. But one way that I think that community priorities are supposed to be included when we're talking about these federal dollars and some of these new programs that are rising because of the IRA is that a lot of these projects are supposed to implement what are called community benefit plans or community benefit agreements. And these are really supposed to be opportunities for the recipients of federal funds, whether it's the state government or a business or a nonprofit organization, to it's basically tasking them with the responsibility of making sure they do that engagement with the community. And I think that some people do it better than others. I think we've seen a lot of community engagement plans that have not been truly engaging with the community. A lot of focus on engaging with, for example, local elected officials, which is obviously important, but may not really be a good way of getting to what the community itself needs in every case. And I'd also say the Alliance has been invited to a lot of these conversations, and we're happy to join them. But frankly, nonprofit organizations are also not necessarily representative of what the community's priorities are. And so I think using the community benefit plan and a community benefit agreement process, I think, is one way to get these community priorities involved. But we do need to make sure that we're doing it in the right way and really making sure that we're getting down to the people who have usually been left out of these processes in the past.
Thank you for that. I want to go to you, Dr. Melanson, as one who's working in this space in a variety of ways. And if you can speak really to the implementation side, your thoughts around that.
There's several factors, and I think we talked about the community benefits plans under pretty much Department of Energy grants and their FOAs, and then you also have community investment plans under Commerce. A lot of that, and both just think this broadly of those two organizations, but before DOE was really more focused on nuclear. About 80% of their funding was on nuclear, and then the rest was on what's going on with the national labs. This is pretty much the first time since these agencies are doing kind of direct service related work and workforce development. So from the broader aspect of things, I think one is there's a lot more education that needs to happen at the community level, just kind of general marking, understanding this energy transition, and having a clear understanding of there's still a need for a diesel engine technician here in Louisiana, and probably for some time for the next 15 to 20 years. But at the same time, that diesel technician this month needs to understand about how high voltage electrical, hydrogen fuel cell, and hydrogen combustion engine. And these fuels and transitions will happen as a mechanic throughout these next 20 years. For the next 3 years, 90% of their work probably will be on traditional diesel engines. Next probably 20 years, it'll be a lot different. Probably 80% of the work will be on hydrogen fuel cell and EV related heavy equipment. So with that, and a lot of this transition is the same, you still need your basic technicians to go through this. So there are a lot of job opportunities for these in Louisiana because these traditional industries are growing, but they're transitioning their energy feeds. So with that, it's just thinking about lifelong learning into these occupations and what Bill and Iris have opened up and are providing opportunities. But still, there can be a lot of the community that's going to be left out because they may be afraid to go in these industries because they think they're going to be dying off instead of evolving. And so those are certain things we kind of need to talk about the broader aspect of understanding your career opportunities and the impact and how you can be engaged today, so you're building your future moving forward.
Well, thank you for that. And so, Dr. Upton, I want to come to you because Dr. Melanson, in his response, mentioned a couple of different things about jobs and how we're transitioning. I mean, so as we think about planning and implementing and keeping community priorities at the center, when you think about your areas of interest around environmental economics, how does that intersect? What do you see in that field?
Yeah, sure. So I'm going to back up a little bit and provide some kind of historical perspective of where we are today versus kind of the last half century of environmental regulation, which I think will really put this into context of why we're asking this question. And so if you go back to the Clean Air Act in 1963, the amendments in the 1970s, the very large amendment in 1990, what you really see is that the environmental regulation in the United States was really focused on localize these criteria pollutants that impacted the direct communities for which the emission was occurring. And so as a result, we've set up, these attainment, non-attainment areas. We've had these markets in order to reduce these pollutants. And by the way, I think that those programs have been really successful. We've seen really large reductions in these criteria pollutants over this last half century in the United States. But it really wasn't until the Inflation Reduction Act that the United States took really large action on reducing greenhouse gas emissions. And greenhouse gas emissions are fundamentally different than these localized pollutants, and that the benefits of reduced greenhouse gas emissions accrue not just to the community for which they're in, but they really accrue to the whole globe. And so if you think about the costs and benefits, so there was the, not to get too much in the weeds, but the federal government released OMB Circular A4 last November, and then the updated social costs of greenhouse gases. And it was the framework of how we're going to think about these costs and benefits. And the benefits to these greenhouse gas emissions reductions really accrue to the whole globe. And they accrue over a very long time period of over a century. And so now what we're doing is we're coming into these local communities and we're asking them to implement projects and these different things that the benefits are these global benefits. And that's great. Let's definitely communicate those global benefits to these local communities. But what I think is also really important is that we're able to communicate to those communities the localized costs and benefits as well. And I think that this is really, really the big kind of turning point of why this has been really different than the historical reductions in pollution reduction that we've seen. So, of course, I can't tell you what the kind of optimal strategy for this is, but certainly I can tell you that the role that we take as a university is really being that information provider. So going into these communities and answering questions. We've had town halls here at our Center for Energy Studies. We do lots of engagement in town halls such as this, going around the state and really answering these questions. And the thing that I tell these communities is that we have frameworks for assessing these localized costs and benefits, for estimating what are the kind of employment effects of these different projects that are coming into your community. What are the tax revenues that can come in from these things? And I think it's really empowering those communities with really high quality information from someone who's not trying to convince them to do or not do something, but that is simply there to be the person who's studying that and providing that information. And so that's really the role that we try to take here at the university.
Thank you for that. Thank you for that, Dr. Upton. Candace, Stephen, I'm coming to you. I want to give you an opportunity to respond to this question, or anything you've heard in these initial responses.
Most oil companies like Chevron, Shell, and ExxonMobil, who has a refinery in Baton Rouge, they already have transition plans away from fossil fuel business toward clean, renewable energy and are investing accordingly. Sometimes their fossil fuel profits are invested publicly, like Shell providing $25 million to start the LSU Institute for Energy Innovation. Louisiana has captured 50% of Gulf Coast energy manufacturing investments in the last decade, and in the recent year, about 25 billion of investments have been announced in Louisiana projects. Not all of those are renewable energy, though many are. First Solar is planning to build a $1.1 billion plant making PV solar modules in New Iberia, creating 700 stable, good-paying jobs. Off Louisiana shore, leasing agreements had been made with at least 3 foreign energy companies, RWE, Vestas, and Diamond, to develop wind energy. Edison Schuest Offshore is building boats in their Louisiana shipyards to service the wind farms. Some of these investing companies have cited the favorable political and economic climate created by the 2022 Louisiana Climate Action Plan and its goals as a motivation to invest here. Fossil fuel industries will be around for many more decades, though as their influence begins to wane, Louisiana is positioning itself well in anticipation of future renewable energy potential that will be employing and economically supporting the area in ways the petrochemical industry historically has done.
No, thank you for providing those detailed stats for us to help us understand the level of investment that's being made that these in our local community here in Louisiana as a result of what they're seeing in the policy changes here. Candace, I want to come to you as we kind of put a bow on this first question. We were talking about, how can we ensure community priorities at the center of the climate pollution reduction planning and implementation, but then also other thoughts you've heard from your colleagues sharing tonight.
I kind of like to piggyback off what Greg was saying because I work, like I said, with La House, part of LSU Ag Center. And I love that I can kind of tell everybody we're not selling anything. We're just here to educate you. So it's great because people want to listen, and it's all research based. I'm like, it's research based. These are the methods. I'm not telling you, hey, go to ABC or XYZ. This is the method. Do with it what you will. But like he said, we focus a lot on extension and outreach, all the way from youth activities to teach them about flooding, energy efficiency, all kind of things like that, all the way to, adults in the community, and also people in the, the builders and the insurance people and the realtors. We go from one end to the other to try to educate everybody so that we can make Louisiana better. And we also go into those communities, like you're saying, with the education, with the activities. So we do get on the, on the ground, boots on the ground with the community to find out what they need and help them get educated.
So I want to continue with that theme of education. I'm coming to you, Dr. Rosenberg, right? That sometimes pollution can not necessarily be clearly defined, right? We hear it, everybody doesn't understand the impacts of it, how it affects us in the long term. And we know, based off your expertise, there are a variety of actions that can be taken to reduce pollution. But Dr. Rosenberg, we'll start with you, and then others who want to chime in, you definitely can. Can you explain or educate us on some of the ways climate pollution impacts everyday lives, and what pollution reduction solutions you think would be most beneficial to the local community, and why?
Yeah, so pollution shows up in our daily lives. Like whenever I was teaching at Southern years ago, I remember leaving class and all the students and I would just be out of breath from the pollution at nighttime from the nearby plants. Like it impacts their college experience, so it has a very daily presence in those communities. We know it impacts asthma rates and cancer rates in Southeast Louisiana, because we know this is not just Baton Rouge, but regional impacts and statewide impacts for pollution. And it also has reproductive impacts, and as well as autoimmune. And so we see in Black and Brown communities that are around plants that are heavily polluting, that there are adverse health outcomes. But there's also the health costs, right? Like as a state, we're spending so much more, and our country doesn't yet, right, have a preventative healthcare model. And so a lot of our efforts to curb health outcomes that are adverse are really just a waste, because we're not doing enough to address and to regulate the plants. And then, of course, taxes. So between taxes and health costs and taxes that are lost to these companies that heavily pollute, our state really just suffers. And Baton Rouge is a prime example of that. And the second part of your question, so what would be most beneficial? So just from our work in Baton Rouge, we do have a Baton Rouge group. We have folks that are heavily focused, not just on elections and having climate champions, but also on transit. And after years of dealing with just the state government in general, former attorney general, et cetera, it's really crucial that whatever plans we're developing around climate in order to center communities, we're addressing the adversarial approach that our state government has towards the EPA that has worked very hard to address the disadvantaged communities' pollution that they're experiencing. And also, we need to recognize that as far as like infrastructure, cars are going as far as they can go in all the places they can go in Baton Rouge. And so spending billions of dollars on mega projects like the bridge, for example, is a waste. And so how do we really invest in people's quality of life, public transit, mobility, movement freely between North and South Baton Rouge, to jobs, to family, to community? I think that's super crucial. And then the last thing I was going to say is just avoiding false solutions. So we have had plenty of communities stand up in the greater Baton Rouge area, including Ascension, state that they do not support a lot of the carbon capture and sequestration projects that are being proposed, because these pipelines and other projects are going in communities that already deal with pollution. They're not going in other communities other than, unfortunately, when it was proposed, or as it's proposed for Lake Maurepas. And so, yes, I am always selling something on my end. That's the freedom of being a volunteer. We're focused on addressing the climate crisis at the local level. And yeah, I think these would be some pretty beneficial measures. And we've heard this from people at our meetings who are also regular folks, volunteers, and very concerned about the direction of our state and city.
Others, what other strategies do you think would be beneficial to the local community, and why, in the work that you're doing? You got to come off mute, Dr. Melanson.
Jonathan, I think someone's still engagement. There's still a lot of wonderful opportunities. I've been very excited for some of the work that Southern University has done, like on expungements. If you don't work in the petrochemical, you have to get a TWIC, pass a Homeland Security card, and many times it's for terrorist activities. I've worked a lot with inmates and so forth. I have yet to come across anybody has a terrorist activity, but a whole population, really 1 in 3 African American males are sadly somewhat involved in Louisiana with the judicial system, and dealing with the background issues and kind of dealing with expungements and getting TWIC waivers. These are still high-paying jobs inside this sector, but they're also part of the solution, because, like we mentioned before, a lot of these plants are improving their emissions and providing new technologies. And I do don't want to exclude anybody from great high pay, but it's still working those barriers to a grateful employment for all of our community members. And same for different aspects for women, single mothers, shift level childcare and early morning daycare and so forth, because these plants operate not on a banker schedule and so forth. So I think more people get engaged into our industries, because a lot of people are not engaged. I won't say they're excluded, but they just don't know the pathway to these operations. And at the same time, it also, like what Angel mentioned, is build the community advocacy of making sure we always need somebody to just kind of look over our shoulders and be engaged in the information that Greg provides and Candace from LSU. It just helps us move in this energy transition because we don't, we have a very strong economy compared to other economies to our east of us in other states because of the industry, but it's just making sure we're all engaged and doing everything safely and effectively moving forward. But the key thing I looked at is make sure we have more people and more diverse people working in these industries.
Okay. Coming to you, Stephen, beyond the environmental benefits, how can clean energy and pollution reduction solutions contribute to community resilience and self-sufficiency?
Thanks for having us all here and for asking me. There are a number of ways. First, when extreme storm events disrupt general electrical service, individual solar arrays, if accompanied with increasingly affordable battery storage, can maintain single-family homes with operational electricity. Recently, near the landfall of Hurricane Milton along the Florida Gulf Coast, the resiliently designed Hunters Point community in Cortez weathered the storm with intact buildings and some operational electricity from solar arrays integrated into their roofs that kept recharging each day while millions around them were without power. Another utility scale solar array and its underground electrical lines helped shelter thousands of citizens of nearby Fort Myers, Florida, evacuating the coast. Our city is developing with Together Baton Rouge a pilot solar energy program to create what they are calling community lighthouses. Eventually, 24 church congregations and community institutions with solar power and backup batteries to help shelter local citizens during potential utility service disruptions. Secondly, electric and hybrid electric cars can provide self-sufficiency and independence with a minimum of carbon pollution, with increasing potential ranges of travel. According to Louisiana Illuminator, auto and battery manufacturers have invested more than 100 billion in the EV sector and created more than 100,000 U.S. jobs, making electric cars about 20% of the U.S. and worldwide automotive markets. And it is expected to be 50% worldwide in only about 5 years. Louisiana has presently less than the national average, although it has allowed more time for charging infrastructure to develop, with 265 stations that can fully charge an EV battery in as little as 20 minutes. Funding is in place to build such charging stations every 50 miles along the state's interstate freeways and other selected corridors. Baton Rouge is considering incentives to include EV charging stations in new developments, and like the state, it is planning to transition 50% of its 2,000 vehicle municipal fleet to zero emission by 2035 and 100% by 2050. My hybrid electric Chevrolet Volt allows me to travel from home to work and home again on electricity from plugging it into a standard outlet overnight. Finally, along with some of the wind farms developing off the Louisiana coast, there are 4 utility scale solar arrays of 50 to 300 megawatts, either completed, under construction, or planned within miles of East Baton Rouge Parish. 1 megawatt can power about 400 homes. These sources will help ensure state and local residents have healthy, renewable working options for electricity. The macro scale effects of a collective shift toward clean energy should help moderate global warming that seems to be slightly intensifying recent storms, helping make resilience to them a little easier in time.
So thank you for that, especially the practicality of the Fort Myers, I believe you mentioned example recently as they had to deal with the hurricane. And so what I want to make sure I heard you say clearly is that there are some efforts happening now where should power be lost as a result of a storm, a building or structure can be powered with solar panels. Did I hear that correctly?
An individual structure, if it has battery storage, can do it. In the instance of, it's sort of a suburb of Fort Myers, they have a new kind of dedicated solar array, and they've got underground lines. And so they were able to set up like shelters in their schools and public facilities to shelter some of the evacuees from the coast, because their electricity was going to stay consistently operational from their solar array and underground transmission lines.
Oh, that's great. I'm glad to know you're my new friend with the city. So when we decide to do that here in Baton Rouge, I can work to make sure my neighborhood is somewhere, not, it don't have to be first on the list, but somewhere close to the top as we deal with these hurricanes. Candace, coming to you, right? Implementation of energy efficiency and resiliency solutions at the residential level, right? I mentioned the hurricanes, we get these extreme events that are happening. How can we begin to implement some of these solutions?
Well, again, we just like to educate the public on, I mean, of course, we educate them on fortified and, you know, all that kind of stuff, like Florida, like Alabama. But we also, I like to tell people, if you can't afford this or you can't do this, you can use aspects of it. Use the ring shaped nails, or for energy efficiency, make sure you have enough insulation, even if you have to buy it a roll at a time. Or, you know, you could put an attic tent up that keeps the heat in the attic and not in your house. Your AC doesn't have to work as hard, and the energy bills won't rise. And you can buy them at Home Depot for $40. So it's like I try to give them do-it-yourself things they can do it at their house to energy efficient or resilient, sustainable to the weather. But it doesn't break the pocketbook either. It gives them ideas that they can do themselves.
Well, that's great. And I'm coming to you, Jackson. I love the notion of being able to do these things for individuals, for themselves. And I want to amplify a comment that was in the chat, because I think it's going to speak to the question I'm about to ask you, Jackson, right? Nancy Grush commented that the problem with EVs is that lower income people cannot afford them, right? And then I think that speaks to that sometimes in implementing some of these energy efficiency solutions for a resident can be challenging, right? And so how can we make sure home energy efficiency accessibility is for everybody, for all all households? You know, are there some opportunities as a part of the IRA to do that?
Absolutely. The IRA does provide a lot of good opportunities on electric vehicles, and I think it's an important point. The price of electric vehicles is starting to come down as they manufacture more of them and build new models. That's going to kind of shift back and forth as those things change. And obviously, some auto manufacturers are talking about focusing more on hybrids for now rather than just electric vehicles. It's going to just kind of be the turn of the marketplace, I think, for that. But there are pretty generous tax credits available for electric vehicles through the IRA. And so if you are interested in an electric vehicle, I would strongly encourage you look into that, because a lot of electric vehicles that are on the market right now are eligible for those tax credits, and they can reduce the cost by a fair bit. Not probably enough to help somebody who doesn't make enough money in general, but for people who are middle income, I think it does provide some assistance. Aside from that, when we're talking about the home, and energy efficiency is something that we focus on quite a bit at the Alliance, and something that we encourage people to look into. The IRA provides a whole suite of funding options, tax credits, rebates that have to be implemented both at the state level in addition to the federal programs existing. Some of those are directly available to people from the federal government, but many of them are going to come online in Louisiana as the state rebate program is established. And so those are a lot of the most generous ones, and the ones that are going to be most important to people for upgrades to their homes, whether it's investing in new appliances, or making upgrades to your electrical panel, or making upgrades to the weathering strips, things like that. Weatherization. Weatherization is something that actually the state and the federal government already provide some assistance with, and the IRA is going to provide additional assistance to make that even more affordable to more people across the state of Louisiana and across the country. I think Candace mentioned fortified roof earlier as well. That's also, frankly, something that does touch on energy efficiency, right? Making sure that your home is actually built and constructed in a way and upgraded in a way that makes sure that you retain heat, retain cool in the summer. Make sure that you're not leaking air really throughout the year. That's a serious problem that we have here in Louisiana. Our housing stock tends to be older, tends to be in poorer condition, in part because of the weather that we experience and the storms that we experience. It requires a lot more maintenance than other places. And so taking advantage of the IRA funds, that hopefully we'll see the state roll out the state rebate program in the near future, so that people can fully take advantage of it. But there are a lot of pots of money that are available to people now through the IRA and through the IIJA that will allow us to make some substantial upgrades to people's homes and help save people money.
Thank you for that. And I want to come back to you, Candace, because Jackson mentioned term weatherization, right? Can you define that for us and give us some kind of practical steps in addition to some of the, I think you mentioned earlier? How do we weatherize our home moving forward?
I mean, we teach people, you know, check your air conditioner filters, date them, so you'll know what, you know, when the last, you can check them every, you know, 3 months or a month, and you'll know exactly when you replace them so you don't forget. Weather stripping, like you said, caulk the windows, anything we can Entergy actually has a free audit, house audit that you can actually get done, and they'll come do a blower test and a duct test in your house to let you know where, if you're leaking air, to help you. And just to piggyback off of what Jackson was saying, yes, there's tons of resources, tons of tax credits, grants. The Louisiana Housing Corporation has iLeap. They help with energy bills and, other things. And then also the Department of Education. I was just at energy is releasing a ton of money straight to consumers too, to help with a bunch of things.
Thank you for that. And so as a result of my window not being caulked and air seeping out, it's making my air conditioning unit work harder and contribute to the pollution that we're seeing in our local community.
And contributes to the energy burden, because a lot of houses, they have to choose, do I want to eat or can I pay my electricity bill? And you don't want people to have to face that. So any little thing they can do, even if you have to buy a tube of caulk at a time, like I said, with the insulation, do it little by little, but it works, it helps, and it does the job. And it helps bring that energy cost down to the consumer.
Thank you for that. And Jackson, I heard you say the state is getting their rebate program up and going. Do you know, I don't want to speak too prematurely, estimated time frame? I know it may not be your area, but since you brought it up, I'm just curious.
I don't know the time frame. I do know that the state energy office has been working hard on this for the last couple of years since the IRA was rolled out. And I think we're all cautiously optimistic that the state will receive those funds and roll out the program sometime in the near future.
Okay, awesome. Thank you for that. Dr. Upton, our local economy is heavily dependent on the petrochemical industry. And I think I heard Dr. Malone mention that he's talked about making sure that we can remove barriers and hurdles to individuals being employed. Let's talk a little bit about decarbonization. What is decarbonization as it relates to the industrial processes? And can you explain one strategy you think is key to achieving decarbonization?
Yeah, sure. So for a little bit of perspective first on the impact for the local economy in terms of the jobs and then the strategy. So first, a little context. So if we think of the energy sector, or I guess really the oil and gas sector in Louisiana, in kind of two buckets. So the first, you have what's called upstream oil and gas extraction and services sector. So those are, think about geologists who are, studying the subsurface, where the hydrocarbons could be, the companies that drill the wells, and then you've got the companies that once they're in production, they manage the facilities that are producing oil and gas. That's kind of upstream. Then you add the refining, chemical manufacturing, you can call it petrochemicals, others call it energy manufacturing, where you take these hydrocarbon-based feedstocks and some other feedstocks such as brines, but then you then manufacture those into products that you and I use every day. So that's going to be chemicals, plastics, liquid fuels, fertilizers, these things that we use. And if you look at in Louisiana, the upstream oil and gas extraction and services sectors pre the 2014 price crash employed about 50,000 workers in the state. When the price crash in late 2014, early 2015 happened, we lost about 18,000 of those jobs within that sector. That actually put Louisiana into a recession while the rest of the U.S. economy was still in expansion mode. We kind of, this sector came back a little bit, but not too much, kind of, levelized off there. And then the pandemic hit, and we lost about 8,000 to 9,000 more jobs in that sector. And so today we actually have about half the number of jobs in the upstream oil and gas extraction services sectors than we do just a decade ago. So it's kind of a, it's been a huge impact on the state's economy. On the flip side, though, the reason the price, of course, declined is because we had this advent of oil and gas production from these shale geological formations. And that has led to an enormous increase in oil and gas production. The United States is the largest oil and gas producer in the world. We've also seen a decade of sustained growth of oil and gas production. And all the forecasts that are out there, and including our forecast here at the center, as well as the EIA and others, forecast that oil and gas production will continue to increase into the future. And what that's done is that's created all these industries that now manufacturing those hydrocarbons in order to export those products globally. So as a result, we've seen billions of dollars in the investment in refining, chemical manufacturing, and all these sectors. So how does decarbonization, and by the way, as a result, we've seen a decade of growth of employment in those refining and chemical manufacturing sectors. For the first time now, Louisiana employs more people in that kind of petrochemical sector than we do in the upstream. And that's still very different than Texas, our neighbor, for instance. It still employs a lot more people in the upstream oil and gas sector. So what are the kind of stylized facts of what those sectors are dealing with? Well, number one, energy demand in the United States has been really flat over the last decade. And the reason for that is we've had economic growth, which leads to an increase in energy demand. But at the same time, you've had efficiency gains. And so as a result, in the US and in Western Europe, energy demand's actually been really, really flat. And if you look at any of these outlooks, electricity or energy demands actually projected to be relatively flat in the United States over the next decade. And so I just said, well, we've had this enormous increase in energy production. And by the way, it's not just oil and gas. We've also had an enormous increase in renewable energy production over the same decade. While at the same time, demand's been flat. Well, where's that energy gone? It's gone to the developing world. And so we're seeing billions of people, hundreds of millions of people over the last decade getting access to things that you and I take for granted every day: electricity, access to transportation. And so the demand growth for the products that we produce here in the Gulf Coast region of the US is really facilitating that economic development, that economic growth of those developing countries. And so what this means for us is we, of course, have now countries around the world have made these decarbonization commitments. And they're telling these sectors here in Louisiana that they want to, number one, for you to document what their emissions are, and number two, show that you're competitive on those emissions. And so what these companies increasingly are doing, when you talk about them, they talk about balance. So on one hand, we can take kind of the net zero approach where we say, look, we're going to reduce our emissions, we're going to get to net zero. If we go there and we don't really pay attention to the cost, what we might find is these products we're selling into this global marketplace, maybe they're too expensive. You lose market share. And if that occurs, well, then you're probably not going to decarbonize this global economy, as we were talking about earlier. But on the other hand, we can take what I call the ostrich approach, where we say, I want to put my head in the sand. I don't want to think about this decarbonization thing. We're going to be business as usual as we've done the last century. And if we take that approach, what we might find is that other parts of the world are able to produce those products at a lower carbon intensity and ultimately sell them to the world. Last year, I had a great opportunity to go visit Riyadh in Saudi Arabia, and this was the exact discussion that they were having. Looking at the Gulf Coast of the United States, the other Gulf Coast of the world, saying, how can we balance this better? And so that's really what it is. It's a balancing act of reducing the emissions intensity of these sectors, while at the same time is making sure that you're cost competitive and that the global market is willing to purchase those products.
Okay. Awesome. Thank you for that, and especially that perspective as it relates to not just here in the US, right, but across the globe, and how that is driving some of the things that we're doing here.
That's right. And I think if there's one takeaway from tonight is that greenhouse gas emissions are a global pollutant, which is very different than we've thought about pollution historically, which is this localized thing. And so we've got to think about the benefits of the emissions reductions from a global standpoint, but also how achieving this decarbonization that benefits the globe, acknowledging that it's okay for that individual community that's seeing that investment to also ask how it benefits and impacts them.
Yeah, doesn't have to be either or, can be both and. Yeah. Dr. Lamalonso, I want to bring you in here. And I heard Dr. Upton speak about employment, how we saw it kind of go up and then kind of almost flatline, what I heard him say. But the industrial workforce transition that's happening, right? What are the opportunities for industrial workforce transition to low carbon industries?
Yeah, I'm just kind of going to build off what Dr. Upton talked about. We're very fortunate especially in the petrochemical side of things. All the things you talked about, weatherization of the home, the caulk, the insulation, the new advanced materials, the gases that go inside of low E level glass. All that basically comes from our backyard, from petrochemical and advanced gases. So us being part of we may not build all the windows. We may not, have an installation plant or a caulk plant here, but we have all the chemicals and the products that go into this, to the feedstock. And that provides so many opportunities for moving forward to help us green, even just oil. Just the byproduct of oils. You can't have an efficient car if you have a lot of friction in the bearings. So all those things help us to be a more greener, community and consumers at the same times. So these things are more affordable as we do, so we can all afford these green opportunities. So we don't have to pay so much on utility bills. So that provides job opportunities. And in just the job sector alone, so let's talk about this. Across the board, construction, manufacturing, industrial, roughly between 70, almost 80, in some subsectors, 90% are, right now just, I say male and pale. It's primarily male, and they look more like Greg than to me, but there are opportunities there of, traditionally it was kind of a good old boy system. That's kind of before the community college system and ABC came along, and now more people of color getting into these pathways and going through training programs are more familiar. So that is transitioning, and there's a lot of opportunities for young people to get engaged in this sector because by 2030, at least 65 of these industrial workers will be 65 and up. So they're going to be retiring now. Good jobs, good pensions, and benefits, and so that opens up opportunities. But to have a good career in this, you're going to have to be trainable, because what you do today as a millwright, as a pipe fitter, or even as a welder will be different in 10 years or 15 years, because it'll be more automated. You're going to be doing more with less, but it also brings in more safety and more way of analytical skills of doing that. But you got to have a clear understanding of your base legacy skill. So with that, there's a bright future for us, and what Jackson mentioned too, with the investments of cleaning the processes of the emissions, that makes sure these companies can operate safely within our backyard. So you get both the best worlds, like Greg talked about. What's good for Donaldsonville will also be good for California at the same time, or Europe, because they're global companies. So basically that's where we are. We're in a very sweet spot, and I think we all just try to get more engaged with the industry side of things, and just kind of see where the science is taking us on emissions and what plants are doing about emission controls. And that's not just emission. We also need to talk about water. We also need to talk about other environmental factors, methane, and other things that they are working on improving too, because it's just not one thing that affects a community. But all those things that used to have problems with, to clean those processes and maintain those processes also provide great paying job opportunities for this community.
All right. And so even as we transition, there are still opportunities available for a workforce. And it's not necessarily the doom and gloom that if we lose the petrochemical industry, that we're just going to automatically lose a large sector of jobs.
Well, yeah, I grew up in Southeast Chicago, so I saw when manufacturing left, and those communities became brownfields. So I saw firsthand how kind of hope and opportunity in the early 70s was strong, and then in the 80s and 90s, those plants left and nothing came back in, and except for crime and despair. And so I'm pretty bullish on, if let's try to keep what we can and grow it and support it, as long as they're playing by the rules and being communicating what they're doing. It's not perfect. There are car accidents that happen all the time, but everybody gets on the interstate really plans to go home safely, but things do happen. It's just making sure they don't have repeat accidents, and they're learning from their mistakes as we move forward.
All right. Dr. Rosenberg, I saw your hand go up.
Yeah, I just wanted to kind of add to the discussion, like kind of recenter though, because if we're talking about a climate plan, a lot of our discussion is really heavy on economy that's really inaccessible even if you do all the things as far as diversity, equity, and inclusion, it's an economy that's really inaccessible to most, and especially to the people that are most polluted by these plants that we've been talking about or around. And at the end of the day, we live in a country, in a state where these corporations are not playing by the rules. And so centering a climate plan around organization or companies, corporations that are expected to do the right thing in a state that is the most polluted, that produces the most pollution, is the most energy inefficient, and to try and like divorce that from the fact that our country produces the most per capita emissions in the world still just doesn't really look forward. So I just would hope as the plan is being developed and we're centering communities that we're realistic about the fact that we're in an accelerated climate crisis situation. And if our coast is gone in a couple of decades and half the people are moving, I don't know how any of these economic discussions even matter at that point. So I just want to be sure that like we're very clear that this is a corporation. We saw the map. Industries are responsible for these the destruction of the planet, quite frankly, and individual actions are not going to save us. And so putting too much on individual community actions just feels irresponsible.
Thank you for that, Dr. Rosenberg. All right, so let me take a few questions I see in the chat, and so I'm gonna try to get through. I saw several, but I want to try to get as many as we can in the time we have. And I may not necessarily ask them in order, so for our listening audience, but I will try to get to each of them. We were talking about greenhouse gas emissions, and so Greg, this was a question for you. If reducing greenhouse gas emissions is a global benefit, which may be a less relevant reason for local communities, and the local benefits are about taxes, jobs, and perhaps other factors, is climate action from the perspective of local communities more an economic agenda and less an environmental agenda, which has implications for how we tell the story? I know it seemed like a bit there, but
Yeah, no, absolutely. I think it's a great question. And I think that the question really hits on the key issue of when we talk about frameworks for emissions reductions, to not conflate localized pollutants with global pollutants, because the policy frameworks that we can implement in order to reduce those in a way that pass a societal cost benefit test are going to be fundamentally different. And so when it comes to the kind of local community, historically, when we would reduce these localized pollutants, it would be that community that reaped all the benefits of course, not all, but, the benefits of that reduced pollution. And that's just a fundamentally kind of different conversation with climate. And do you mind, Jonathan, can I actually share my screen here to show a slide from a peer-reviewed paper on this? Is that acceptable?
yes, I can't control it, but let's see if you should be able to share if you have
All
a
right,
reason.
there we go. So yeah, so this is so there were three kind of seminal papers that were cited in the updated social cost of greenhouse gases that came out last December from the EPA. And so this is one of those models. It's called the GIVE model by Renard et al. This was a 2022 published in the journal Nature. We had Brian Prest who presented this here at our Center for Energy Studies. And so you're welcome to go if you really want to get into what are climate damages, how does climate change impact people. This is a really, really great, it gets into a little bit in the weeds, but I definitely recommend you do it. But this is this model. And what it does is it has the four big categories that lead to damages from climate change. And the first is mortality. The second is ag productivity. The third is energy usage. And then the fourth is coastal sea level rise. And so as you can see here with mortality, it says that, okay, if you increase the temperature relative to the pre-industrial era, as you increase it, you get more mortality globally. And so what this means is and these models have these different regions. And so if you go to a place that is much further north, let's say Canada, they have more deaths from extreme cold than they do from extreme heat. And so those areas actually in this category will actually benefit from a warmer climate because they'll have less of those deaths. Here in Baton Rouge, where we have more deaths from extreme heat, And so therefore we're going to be a net, net kind of loser there. And when you net that out over the whole world, this is kind of what you get. And a lot of these damages really come from sub-Saharan Africa, Asia, these kind of lower income areas that don't have access to air conditioning and heating and everything. You can see this is agricultural productivity. And so kind of the impacts of there. And so within about 2 degrees, 3 degrees, there's no net impact of agricultural productivity, but of course it's going to shift. And then you have this increase in energy consumption, which we've talked about. If it's a hotter climate, then we have to use more AC. And then you've got coastal sea level rise here. And this again is global. And so we've spent a lot of time, the literature of really quantifying what are these global costs to greenhouse gas emissions. And that is what we've done in order to develop these frameworks for social cost of carbon, which was, by the way, the framework for which the IRA subsidies were actually determined, of kind of what are the levels of those in there. So it's a really great discussion. But yeah, the locals, to the question, certainly rightfully can ask, hey, look, we're going to have this investment that benefits the globe. I think it's completely legitimate for that local community to ask, okay, what's the cost benefit for me as a community, which is different than that global benefit.
Thank you for that. Will the current administration continue the state's climate action plan developed in 2022? Jackson, anybody? I'm just throwing this one here. I don't know if any of you have served a part of that. You have any information on that?
Sorry, I just wanted to address it. It's actually it's a separate climate action plan the state is developing, and they're still working on it. CPEX is involved with that, and we're in communication with them and kind of trying to work alongside them. But it's still in development. They're also working on, they did their PCAP and they're working on their CCAP as well. But it is a separate engagement process that they'll follow. And as far as how the administration feels about it, I don't know about that, but it is still actively in development.
Thank you, Laura. Moving on to, go ahead.
I did want to pick Greg's brain a little bit about it. I think it was mentioned before, just the southern region. So say, I hate to get to mixing politics, but say the redder states, Texas, Mississippi, Alabama, with the IRAs and bills, they have benefited more without some type of California, 2030, 2050 state policy, and then each counties have very aggressive goals. But we have private sector, it seems like they have, regardless of the administrations, they're trying to improve their processes to be more efficient, but also may have less emissions on the same side too. But I want Greg, actually, the economist side of that, he may give a little more clearer picture of the numbers of that, but broadly, that's what I see with the federal investments and how private industry has responded to those federal investments.
Yeah, absolutely, Gerard. And you can point to the emissions trading system in Europe, and they're now rolling out their CBAM, their carbon border adjustment mechanism. This is just one example of a policy that will tax products coming into a jurisdiction that are produced here in the Gulf Coast based upon their carbon intensity. And this is sending an economic incentive to companies in order to respond to that. Just yesterday, we were, of course, Dr. Bill Cassidy, our U.S. Senator, had an entire day that we sat down and discussed this exact issue. And he is pushing his foreign pollution fee. So for companies that want to import products to the United States, if the greenhouse gas emissions intensity of those products is higher than here in the United States, Senator Cassidy proposes to actually tax those products for that difference in emissions intensity. And this is a discussion we're having around the globe, and is one of the things that I tell state policymakers is that, we have our policies here and people will have different opinions of climate and impacts and all that, and that's fine. People can have their opinions. But the reality is that these global companies that are selling products into this global marketplace, they're going to respond to what those global policies are and what those global markets are telling them, kind of irregardless of what our localized policies are. I think that the IRA certainly has driven the kinds of investments that have occurred, the speed of those investments for that, but it's really that longer term.
I do have a question for you, Dr. Upton, as a result of that statement, but I'm gonna come back to it about the global market.
Sure.
From Brian, the large plants are regulated under federal level Title 10 air permits. What should the local government do to address this?
I think Title VI, right?
It could be a mistype. I just saw what I saw in the chat. So, but if you're familiar with it, Dr. Rosenberg?
Well, I mean, I won't say too much because we were okay. So, I will say because I think the rest of that question also asked about DEQ or what the local government can do.
Yeah, what the local government can do. That was the second part of his question. Title
Okay,
5.
okay. So okay to the first part, but then the second part, so what can local government do? I think what would be super crucial, because we've seen in the past couple of years that EPA has opened investigations into LDEQ as well as LDH regarding the disproportionate harm or the disparate impacts in Black and Brown communities. And I think that our legislature as well, Baton Rouge is the capital, so it's not just the fact that there's the local government and what they can do, but also legislature and governor could do a better job working with DEQ to enforce their regulations as well, not just fining companies, but also raising their standards. We know even EPA standards, to their question about what they regulate or what the plants are regulated under, we know that those aren't stringent enough either. And so just not fighting the EPA when they're trying to get Louisiana to level up, and that's a local and state government problem. And then also increasing our standards and strengthening our standards, because we know that even at the levels that we have right now of pollution, it's leading to disproportionate rates of cancer and autoimmune diseases, like I discussed before. So Louisiana, just for another clarification, a big prong that the EPA was able to use was the discrimination against Black and Brown communities that were impacted by pollution. And that has been taken off of the table as a tool for the EPA because our state government, I guess Attorney General then, sued the EPA over it. And then a judge in Lake Charles more recently took Louisiana completely out of that protection. So we're the only state right now that can't enforce that. And I'm sure that's not going to be challenged by other states because they don't want to have theirs undone in their different circuit courts or taken to the Supreme Court. So our state has done a lot of damage in the last couple of years, honestly.
Thank you, Dr. Rosenberg. Others on the local government effect from policy side, Jackson, Stephen, working for local government. Any comments?
Yeah. So to Brian's next point, he mentioned states cannot have lower regulations than the Fed. That's true, Brian, but the truth is that the Clean Air and Water Acts are largely enforced by state government, right? So the EPA does not do direct enforcement in most cases. They often come down to check on things. They may file suits if something does not add up. But for the most part, those things are left to state agencies and local agencies and people on the ground to actually monitor and deal with on their own. We've seen a lot of cases where LDEQ it shows quite a bit of leniency, I think is fair to say, with incidents happening at petrochemical plants, with pollutant events. And I think that is part of the reason the EPA was looking so closely at LDEQ and at the state government until these court cases happened.
All right.
Baton Rouge has a variety of programs. They are consistent with they're looking to obtain some of the generous federal funding that has been made available via the Inflation Reduction Act and other incentive legislation. So there's a variety of things that they're trying to constructively be on board for. One kind of interesting sort of, I guess, synergy between municipal government and some local not-for-profit organizations has been the clearing and improving of existing stormwater management infrastructure. That is sort of a way of kind of dealing with pollution at a local level, but the reason it's so helpful is because the pollution can clog the stormwater system, and clearing it can help alleviate potential flooding. There are some great local nonprofit organizations like Keep Tigertown Beautiful and the Louisiana Stormwater Coalition. They're working, and the city of Baton Rouge is also working. They're trying to clear, various streets and vacant lots and gullies and bayous and creeks. And by keeping them a little clear, they can help allow rainwater to vacate the area and help better protect residents and businesses buildings from potential flooding.
So Stephen, I want to stay right there. And you all can continue to drop your questions in. We're going to try to get to everyone we can in the next 10 minutes. So everybody may not get a chance to respond, but I will get as many as I can. There's a comment and a question about green infrastructure and urban greenway and the benefits it brings, right? And they talk about Breck Parks provide a large portion of these benefits for the greater Baton Rouge area. And as a part of the 10-year plan, they are considering removing or reducing some of their facilities in strategic locations. What are your thoughts on utilization of some of these spaces and others to increase vegetation with native and beneficial plants, further improving green infrastructure and benefiting the environment? And I think that was directly when you were talking about some of the stormwater stuff that's happening, but I'll give you a moment to respond to that.
And that's a keen observation, and the maintaining natural areas like that is just kind of an intrinsically helpful practice for carbon reduction, because trees and plants, they're taking in carbon dioxide, they're exhaling oxygen. They're a key part of sort of the organic process of carbon reduction, and maintaining those natural areas is a key way we can kind of combine these with the more kind of human artificial efforts that are getting partly underway. And Breck has done to some extent, and in some of their surveys, I recommend that they do it even more, is to they'll create some of these park areas along the creeks. And so if there's a situation in an extreme storm event and they flood, they'll flood these sort of park areas that aren't going to do much damage. It will not be expensive, to reconstruct or anything, areas like that. And really, I've observed the growth of our city, say, in the last 100 years, which has been significant. At one time, there was just a lot more space around. Well, there were marshy kind of swamp areas around a lot of the creeks, like Ward Creek and stuff. Some of those are still partially in existence, say around the Burton Center and things like that. And as development has gradually sort of encroached on some of those areas, it is compromised sort of the natural cycle of allowing those creeks to flood in extreme storm events and having it not be a critical situation, of it flooding buildings and the expense of reconstruction and the burden to the insurance industry, et cetera. And really, we're not going to do it fast, although the city has bought up some areas along some of those creeks. They're buying property and leaving that just to be. They're doing that around the county fairgrounds, around the creeks down from University Lakes, and they're trying to allow areas that can just, it'll be okay for them to flood a little bit, and that helps provide a sort of a buffer, for the rest of the rainwater evacuation system in the area.
Okay. My next question. and I'll open this to anyone who wants to take it. How will we provide enough clean energy needed for the huge increase in the amount of energy needed to run AI data centers?
So I can comment on that. Yeah, you know, we hear this a lot, and I'm actually running some numbers on this for our energy outlook right now that we're releasing in November. And if you think about the like most aggressive, and so there's EPRI, the Electric Policy Research Institute, if you take their most aggressive growth scenario for data centers, it comes out to less than 1% of total BTUs used in the US economy. And so not to downplay that data centers aren't going to use a lot of data, but you know, we've had a decade of kind of flat BTU energy growth in the US, and in their most aggressive scenario, it might account for about less than 1%. So not as usual, the dismal scientist perhaps isn't as worried about some of these things.
I was curious about that. You know, I hear these small plant nuclear, you know, modular build that these AI centers are trying to build. You have coal converting, you have some coal plants that are also converting to small place nuclear plants. Is that to lower, have them have better control the cost of energy? If energy is costing more, is that why they may not be drawing more off the grid, maybe 1% more, but it may be a bottom line investment decision that they're trying to do? Is there anything to play with that?
Yeah, it's a great question, Gerard. So of course I can't speak for an individual company, but my reading of this is that a lot of these companies have made very, very aggressive decarbonization commitments, and are pretty keen on them being like having very much close proximity. And so, you know, I don't think it's good enough to say, oh, well, I purchased these RECs from the market and therefore I'm going to build this data center. And so I think you're seeing a lot of interest in small modular nuclear associated with these. There was a Wall Street Journal article actually this week on that. So I think a lot of those are really driven by these decarbonization commitments.
All right. So thank you all so much for your comments in the chat. There's a robust conversation happening. We appreciate that. There are two more questions I want to get out in our final time together. I want to go back to a question that Nancy Grush presented. And I think Dr. Rosenberg, you may can speak to this, but anybody else, because it talks about, in light of the anticipated transition from fossil fuel vehicles and the higher cost of EVs, perhaps we should focus on improving transit so that it becomes a practical, efficient means of transportation. And I heard you mention earlier about transit in your opening remarks. And so I wanted to not overlook her question, but if you wanted to address it with anybody else, I'll give you a moment to do that. And then we'll come to our final question for tonight.
Yeah, I'll just say like to the original graph that you showed, you know, just keeping in mind that Louisiana is like anything we do in those sectors would be incredible. And transit would be a lower lift, in my opinion. We've worked with several of the people who are on this call, and then also with state and local government around the Baton Rouge to New Orleans rail, which hasn't quite stalled, but is really being stretched out longer than it needs to be. And then because of lack of investment by our state and match funds. But also we've put so much energy as a state into a statewide transportation plan and mega projects that we cannot afford long term, especially because we don't raise enough taxes to afford these mega projects. And so just really shifting our thinking, getting creative, and that would actually center in fully serve Black and Brown and poor communities that already subsidize us car users and drivers on the road. But it would just have to be a bold, sorry, that's my husband in the background. I don't know who's on the phone with, but that would just be a bold move to make instead of kind of waiting for the political winds to change. So yeah, that's what I'll say on that.
Thank you to all of you who are commenting in the chat. We do see that. We are taking note of that and continue the conversation and the resources that you're dropping in the chat. Those are greatly appreciated. To our panel, final question. We'll give each of you about 45 seconds to respond because we want to be respectful of the time for tonight. To each of you, Is there anything else you would add about potential barriers or solutions to climate pollution reduction measures as we close tonight? Anything else you want to add to this conversation as it relates to potential barriers or solutions? I'll start with you, Stephen. Then I'll kind of go to Jackson, Candice, Dr. Melanson, Dr. Upton. And I think I started with you with the first question, Dr. Rosenberg. So I'll give you the final response.
It has been many decades refining the technologies, though now solar and wind are the most affordable ways to produce energy. In addition to their carbon reduction benefits, um, they are the most practical, economically energy investments. Incentives in the Inflation Reduction Act, providing tax refunds or reimbursing 30% or more of project costs, makes them even more practical and will probably help accelerate the transition to those forms of energy generation into the future. As helpful as those trends are, it may be a decade before Louisiana offshore wind farms are significantly operational. Carbon sequestration projects, many of which are planned in Louisiana, will probably not be in operation until 2027, 28. The International Paris Agreement's goals mirrored in the Louisiana Climate Action Plan and the Baton Rouge MSA Climate Action Plan are to keep global temperatures rising no more than 2.7 degrees Fahrenheit from pre-industrial levels by reducing carbon emissions 40 to 50% of 2005 levels by 2030 and 100% or net zero by 2050. There is still a good ways to go. And while we seem to experience nearly record high temperatures almost each new year and watch tropical storms accelerate slightly quicker in intensity across a slightly warmer Gulf and Atlantic, it would be most constructive for us to bear with the moderate transition measures gradually being constructed, planned, or proposed in order to help best ensure the habitability of these Mississippi River alluvial plains well into the future.
Thank you so much, Stephen. I think, Jackson, you were next. I want to amplify this question just so people can respond in the chat. And this came from Yule. What are the most important 1 or 2 concrete actions the BR Baton Rouge MSA plan should include? And so if you have thoughts around that, you're on with us tonight, please drop your responses in the chat for that so we can collect that information. Jackson, the floor is yours.
Sure. So as far as potential barriers and solutions go, I do think that it's in many ways, and I think many people on the call will agree with this. The climate crisis is really a coordination problem, right? There's a lot of different activities that contribute towards climate change. There are a lot of different activities that are needed to address it. And that makes it very difficult when we have lots of different actors with lots of different incentives and lots of different motivations for what they're doing. There are frankly some entities and corporations and governments that won't benefit from transitioning as quickly as we might need to really address some of the challenges and dangers that we face from extreme weather events, from global temperature rising, things like that. And that is a serious problem. And I think that leads to what the solution is, which is that we have to rely on really coming together and thinking about public goods in a serious way, I think. And that usually means working through the government to find solutions that don't produce losers necessarily, but help us find new ways of doing things. I think one thing that was said earlier, and I think kind of stuck with me, is that the idea that we don't stop doing things just because there's some danger inherent to it, right? So we don't stop driving cars or producing cars because there are accidents on the interstate. But I think that we have to start thinking about the alternatives here, which is why don't we build a train, right? Why don't we invest in public transit? Why don't we provide people opportunities that take us off of that system that may be imperfect in ways that are harmful, and instead investing in things that are less harmful and also better for us in general? So I think that that's really what we have to think about when it comes to climate change and the climate crisis. And I think that's what we need to think about in Baton Rouge for this climate plan.
Thank you, Jackson. Dr. Melanson?
Hey, Jonathan and everybody, I really enjoyed this panel. Just the diverse thoughts and frameworks and ideas has been a great learning for myself. Just real quick, the community, just don't be paralyzed. Just get engaged. I'm a workforce person. I think if you do anything in petrochemical and industry, it's going to be transferable for your whole career. It's going to look different for today and in 10 years, but get started. And one thing is to prevent, don't do the Google Glass call of workforce. Just don't do the trend of something. Just don't be a solar panel installer, be an electrician. Just don't do EV installer, be a full licensed electrician. And I'm saying electrician over and over again, because we just need a lot more electricians to be part of this energy transition.
Candace?
Yeah, I mean, I would say just, education. We just need to educate our community and listen to our community on what they need to help them get what they need so we can have a better Louisiana.
Education. Dr. Upton.
Yeah, I just really echo Candace's comment about just the role of the university is really to be there to be that provider of information. We're actually working right now in order to release a framework for how universities are engage with communities for this community benefits planning process. It's a collaborative process. It was instigated by the Office of Research with colleagues in sociology, environmental sciences, myself that's an economist. And so really what we're doing is thinking about how you structure to listen to the communities, how you identify these localized economic costs and benefits, and how you're able to provide that information back to the community. And so if your community is wanting information, wants to understand how this all comes together and impacts you, please reach out to me. Candace, Gerard, who I don't know if it's okay to say is joining the team here in a few weeks. We'd love to help you. We'd love to provide you information. And thank you all for having me tonight.
Thank you, Dr. Upton. Dr. Rosenberg.
All right. Thank you for having us. It was a good discussion. And I think the big thing is just, as we've all already said, is listen. But I think being prepared to act differently based on what we're hearing. I think the community often does say what they need. And we're just within our frameworks, our jobs, our organizations, not prepared to respond to that. And also potential barriers. So I do want to be specific about that. Just even organizational charts and power mapping and maps of institutional relationships. It took, for example, one of our leads for our transit team work months to figure out how all the different institutions engage with one another. And they have the full-time pay and support to get that done. And yet a regular community member cannot figure out how a mega project that is directly going to impact them can be influenced by them or their community in a different way. And so just we have a lot of plans. We already have quite a bit of climate plans. I know the federal government, through the federal funding, requires additional plans. But I think communities are already used to plans and not a lot of action, especially here in Louisiana. And so just being open to acting and responding differently and democratizing what we already know, because I think people are pretty clear more and more as they see the impacts of the climate crisis that they want a different vision. But even myself as a volunteer, how do we get there when we don't even know how all of the orgs, including, planning commissions and metro councils and mayors all engage with legislature and federal to really move the needle on all of these projects. And the last thing I would say is a barrier is just a lack of a dashboard. There's just not a lot of places that are Louisiana led that shows all the different works that are happening like Jackson described. So I'll leave it with that. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Dr. Rosenberg. To all of our guests tonight, listen, there are one or two links being placed in the chat to complete a short questionnaire about pollution reduction planning in your community. We'd appreciate you clicking on that link, completing that survey. I believe if you find Erica's name, she dropped it in the chat. If you complete that before you disconnect tonight, we would appreciate your input. If you'd like to keep up with our progress about this work, I also see the QR code on the screen. Please visit the project website. Laura's going to drop the links in the chat. Additionally, we are planning some sector-specific focus groups in December. and we may reach out to you to participate in one of those events to continue engaging in this discussion. So thank you all for being here tonight and participating in this virtual town hall. To all of our panelists, to all of our guests, thank you so much. Have a good evening.